they all like how all these areas work together, right? Because you'll have a lot of people, right, such as Shawn, they'll buy a home, and then they'll have Department of Buildings violations, which I deal with now. Or
you felt that?
No, they're not fun.
Well, break that down. Like, what's the Department of Building violation?
So basically, the Department of Buildings violations are when a property owner, knowingly or unknowingly, basically doesn't comply with buildings laws, right? New York City buildings laws. The most common ones we see are like work without a permit, right? So a lot of times people will think they'll get a licensed contractor, right? They'll go down the block. Someone say, I know so and so, my cousin, does this type of work. They'll do it. Maybe sometimes they'll do a great job. A lot of times they don't. But then they'll find out later that person never pulled a permit and they never had a license. And someone thinks, okay, well, I got a deal, so everything's okay. But then the Department of Buildings, they'll come, an inspector will come. They'll say, you have all this stuff in here that you all these fixtures in your home you installed, you didn't have a license to do it. And then they'll hit you with a $2,500 violation. And if you don't comply, or if you don't get the violation dismissed, which is my job as an attorney, I try to go litigate these violations, then you'll get additional ones. So I have some people who I'm actively working with now, and they have like 50 violations. And it comes from 3 underlying violations. Maybe they'll have someone living in their basement, or technically it's a cellar, right? And then the Department of Buildings alleges that they did work in the cellar and they converted the home from a 2 to a 3 family. There's all these nasty violations, and then you get what's called a failure to comply, which is another $1,250 on top of it. And the next thing you know, this person has 50 violations. And what a lot of people don't know, if you owe more than $30,000 for property taxes, for water, and for Department of Buildings or like sanitation violations, or Department of Health violations, the city can actually auction off your home in a tax lien foreclosure sale.
Wow. So even if you're up to date on your payments and stuff like that,
exactly.
If the violations just stack on top of each other, it could just be your property can be taken from you.
Yeah, honestly, it's a lot of senior citizens, right? People who, like, look at this area, right? There are a lot of older people. They bought their homes in the 60s or 70s. They paid off their home a long time ago, but they may not have the money to upkeep the home, right?
Or the knowledge.
You see it a lot in Brooklyn, because if you ever walk down the street in like Clinton Hill or Bed-Stuy, you can tell what kind of like the new people, who just paid $2 million for the house from Ohio, came and they bought the home. And then next door, you can clearly tell it's a senior citizen that's, like African American or Puerto Rican. And you see it a lot. Like, I see it every day. I see it with respect to the oath violations, and also you see it kind of in the foreclosure realm. And these are a lot of people I deal with.
Right. Like, my grandfather had a place in Brooklyn once, and I remember I would go to his basement all the time, and he had a shop down there, like full blown bandsaw. Like, he had a full like shop that he would build things down there, and there's sawdust like everywhere. Like, he didn't sweep up, and then there was like a staircase, like a steps that came down, and it was up to your knees in leaves. Like, he never really cleaned the leaves out. And then one day, like, somebody was like, "Yo, man, that's a fire hazard. Like, that's an automatic. You're gonna get fined for this." And my grandfather was like, "I don't give a shit about that." Like brushing it off. And then later had to like pay when he tried to sell the building. They were like, "Oh, you've got this violation, you got that violation." And so what he wanted to sell for, was affected by all the violations that he had to pay when he had somebody come to appraise it or something like that.
And see, now you're looking at the nexus of what I do and what Shawn does, right? Because what happens is, and I'm sure you can speak to this like in a second, right? So people will go to sell their homes, or people will come, like, let's say they'll buy a home, right? And I've had situations like this, and they'll say, "Oh, well, the previous landlord put this money in escrow, right, to fix these violations." And same thing with like tenants, right? If they don't get tenants out. And the new landlord, and then I'll break down to the new landlord, it's like, well, this is what's going on. Actually, if you don't get this and this dismissed, then you could be looking at $20,000, $30,000 in violations. And they're like, oh, they only put 15 in escrow. And it's like, people don't really know how this stuff works, right? And it's, it's a boon to the Department of Buildings because they're making a lot of money off this stuff.
you find trouble with that when you're buying property? Like sometimes you come up and be like, you know what? There's so many violations on this property. It's not even worth it.
Well, yeah, I buy property in Maryland. I kind of refuse to deal with property in New York City because of buildings.
Because of how they operate.
Really?
So they operate differently in Maryland?
Yes, very different. Give an example. I mean, the fines, you do receive fines, but it's not as steep as the New York City fines you receive, like for trash. That's probably like one of the few fines I've received from the Department of Buildings in Maryland, but they're much more lenient in terms of fines than the boroughs.
Like in what way? Like
Prices of the fines, a cost factor. If you do,
they give you like $100 fine,
$40 fine, $30 fine.